Hi, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you to NarraScope for inviting me and for having me. It's been a really great day of talks. Thank you to B for the introduction. If you hadn't had a chance to play B's game, it was part of the short list of student games. It's called The Note Line. You should definitely check it out. It's a great visual novel. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about this topic called Relearning Narrative Design Lessons from Children's Books. I don't have much of a preamble of who I am. I don't know why I didn't include that, but I'm a narrative designer and I run a solo studio based in Brooklyn that's called SA Games. We make kind of narrative, introspective based games. And I say we, but it's mostly just me. But we released a project called Bundle of Joy in March earlier this year. That is a WarioWare style game with narrative elements that's about early childhood or that's about becoming a father during the pandemic and raising a kid. And so some of the information here is kind of like dovetails into that, but I won't be talking about that project specifically. But if you think that this is funny or cute or whatever, you should go check out that game because there's just more of that there. Okay, cool. So we're going to get started. Oops, let me click here. So this talk is inspired about becoming a parent. I have two lovely, I guess, kiddos, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they couldn't be more dissimilar. The older one is contemplative and kind and thoughtful, perceptive, gentle, and actually struggled with gross motor skills as an infant. And the younger is a cannonball. They're a ball of kinetic energy who jumps first and asks questions, occasionally through tears later. But what they both share is a love for cuddly story time, as depicted here in The Sims. We curl up on the couch together and read pretty much every night, and again in the morning before school. And although they share a love for reading and books, the reading habits are also polar opposites. Notably, my youngest is an eager reader, to say the least. We tend to read the same books over and over, especially as part of our bedtime routine. So he's all but memorized the material. He often ends rhyming couplets with me, channeling his inner Beastie Boy. You know, little Bo Peep has lost her. Thank you. Okay, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but contrary to his angelic, mostly silent older sibling, my youngest often grows impatient with my reading speed. And to make matters worse, he's still beholden to my dulcet tones, which I have honestly fantasized about turning into a full-time YouTube channel. But the only way that he knows how to affect the pacing of our nighttime sagas is to insist we move things along by aggressively reaching for the next page. Now, as any parent might attest to, this isn't even in the top 50 most annoying things that my beloved little toddler does on a daily basis. But the regularity of his impatient speech or his impatient reach can render me kind of a lackluster reader. When you don't know if you have a chance to finish the page, it's hard to really commit, you know? So at my weakest moments, I tend to just kind of let my kiddo take the driver's seat and determine when and where we're going to read. So what the hell does this have to do with narrative design and interactive storytelling, you might ask? And truthfully, not very much. I just like to talk about my kids. But kidding aside, I was initially wowed by my cuddly, drowsy smarty pants. Even with his cursory reads, he could piece together story beats and recount back to me memorable moments in the morning. But as this behavior continued, and as I saw it expressed over many different books, I began to wonder if my child's literary sophistication wasn't actually just the result of very good design. And thus the origins of this talk were born. What I saw in my child's reading was that you could essentially skip every other page and still get the full extent of the story. And it's kind of hard to conceptualize for adult readers and designers how this works. So I wanted to actually bring an example from our kind of regular rotation of books to today's talk. So we're going to talk about Pete the Cat Rides the Train, or Pete the Cat's Train Trip, excuse me. So for my first read through of this book, I'm going to mimic my toddler's reading habits. So for this illustration, I'm going to skip every other line or every other page, and then afterwards, I'm going to reread the full text. Okay, so let's try this out. Pete the cat is going to visit his grandma. He gets to ride on a train. Pete looks up at the big board. Our train is leaving at 10 o'clock, he says. Pete's train has arrived. All aboard, calls the conductor. The conductor comes to collect the tickets. Pete hands over his. Pete follows the conductor from car to car as the floor rumbles under his feet. Pete sees his mom and Bob. They are at the snack bar. Wow, Pete says. The engineer shows him the engine. As they go through the tunnel, Pete gets to honk the horn. On his way back to his seat, Pete stops and makes new friends. Pete plays games. A little kid wears his hat. Pete sings a song. We get off at the next stop, says Pete's mom. Grandma! Pete loves riding the train, but he loves his grandma even more. Oh, thank you. That's correct response. Okay, so as a reminder, that was the edited version. And so now I'm going to read the full text, and I'll probably read it a little bit faster. Pete the cat is going to visit his grandma. He gets to ride on the train. Pete's mom buys 3 tickets. She gives 1 to Pete and 1 to his brother Bob. Pete looks up at the big board. Our train is leaving at 10 o'clock, he says. A train speeds by. That's a cargo train, Bob tells Pete. Pete's train has arrived. All aboard, calls the conductor. Pete's mom finds 3 seats. I can't wait to see Grandma, says Bob. I can't wait to explore the train, says Pete. The conductor comes in to collect tickets. Pete hands over his. I love trains, says Pete. I'll show you around, says the conductor. Pete follows the conductor from car to car as the floor rumbles under his feet. Wow, Pete says when they get to the caboose. We're over a bridge. Pete sees Mom and Bob. They're at the snack bar. I got this for you, says Bob. Pete follows the conductor. He goes to the front of the train. Come in, says the engineer. Wow, Pete says. The engineer shows him the engine. The engineer shows Pete the train's brakes. There's a tunnel up ahead. As they go through the tunnel, Pete gets to honk the horn. Everything's light again. Thanks for showing me around, Pete says. On his way back to his seat, Pete stops and makes new friends. They live in different towns. They are getting off at different stops. Pete plays games. A little kid wears his hat. Pete sings a song. What a groovy ride. We get up at the next stop, says Pete's mom. Pete looks out the window. It's too much power. Pete looks out the window and sees Grandma. Pete is the first one off the train. Pete's grandma gives him a big hug. It feels good. Pete loves riding the train, but he loves his grandma even more. Exactly. Okay, so what are the notable differences between my kiddos' reading behaviors and the full text? What gets skipped over? Do we miss any of the core story? And can we at least follow, along the basic premise? And so I'd argue that there is enough of the story to know what's happening. We can follow the sequence of events and understand the overarching story flow, if you will. But what are we missing from the edit? Anybody want to just shout out? Anybody have thoughts? Sure, totally. Think broader. You're absolutely right, but broader. What do we? Possibly, yes. Yes, context, or what I would say is details, right? We skip over details. Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. So they skip over the content that skipping over the content doesn't turn Pete's train ride into nonsense, but it doesn't leave out fun encounters and characterizations, just like we talked about. The core story is maintained, and readers like my dear boy are given direction or motivation, to use design terminology, but the depth of the story is missing. The hurried reading habits of my sweet baby boy gloss over what I, as a writer and designer, would probably have spent the most amount of time poring over. It's in those details where I really like to work. What I saw, however, was that my own flesh and blood was maybe not as interested in those details as I was. And in truth, what I saw and what I witnessed in my page-skipping toddler was a glimmer of begrudging familiarity. I saw an impatient gamer button mashing to skip through detailed narrative. And listen, we've all been there, right? We're sitting down on our Switch or our Steam Deck or our preferred retro handheld console. We flip it on, load up a save file, remember where we left off, and dive right into gameplay. Then some pesky NPC starts talking to us. And, they're probably saying something really important and expertly crafted, but we're holding down the X button to load, advance, and skip through whatever they're saying. We want to get back to the action, especially when we have so few hours in our increasingly crowded days. We don't want some lore drop to get in the way of leveling up or whatever. But as a designer, the thought that anyone would want to skip over my lovingly crafted narrative makes my skin crawl. Watching my progeny committing this horrific offense was betrayal of the highest order. How could he? Doesn't he know Papa loves details and storytelling? Now, understandably, I'm not entirely sure that Pete the Cat author James Dean, as depicted here, shares my writing preferences. And needless to say, the story of most Pete the Cat's adventures don't contain branching narratives or variable-based logic. However, I do think that the details are still important in Pete's tale. Otherwise, why would Dean include them? So what is a designer to do with a sleepy son or a trigger-happy player? And so there are many answers to this question, many methods available to the narrative designers to write and tackle this conundrum. But watching my youngest, I couldn't help but reconsider what's called the layer cake technique as a possible design solution. I was initially introduced to this technique by Susan O'Connor while enrolled in her course at the narrative department. She attributed this technique to a former mentor of hers, Patrick Redding. And Redding was the narrative director for Far Cry 2, which O'Connor also worked on, and wondered how the complex story he wanted to craft could appeal to players who only played first-person shooter games. At the time, and maybe to this day, the core demographic of first-person shooter gamers weren't playing for the plot, right? So the design challenge of creating compelling narrative for a range of players intrigued Redding and company, and they devised the layer cake technique as a possible solution. So let's take a look at this in action.
Hey, it's you.
How are you? You made it up.
I didn't
introduce myself before. My name is Flora William. You still have that malaria, though, don't you?
You
see that man over there?
He has
He has medicine. You go ask him, he might give some to you.
Take
those pills, compadre. You need them.
You people never stop. There's the bloody tip, all right? That's it. That's all I've got. Well, aren't you going to destroy it? That's what your friends usually do. Wait, you're not here for the tips, are you? I see the problem now. You can get the pills you need from the church in Pala. The priest there will help you, assuming you make it in time. Just pass it along.
You can't bring a man the way you bring a dog or a horse. How do you beat a man to the top?
So you're not one of them. I'm Ruben Loganby, what you call a stringer, and you are new. I can tell by the state of your clothes. You're much too clean. You're taking a chance talking to me. I'm persona non grata around here. The warlords want me out of the country. They don't like the story I'm writing. It's about the war, and about them, of course. But mostly it's about the famous arms dealer, the Jackal. That was him on the tape. Do you know I have covered 16 wars across Africa? 16. And every time he has been there, selling his weapons. And I meant what I said about the tapes.
I loved including that. Okay, so in our initial encounter with, let's see, can I actually advance my slide? Oh yeah, I got it. Okay, cool. So in our initial encounter with Ruben, he hastily gives us a mission, right, to take the recording of the Jackal, the game's antagonist, to the priest in Pala. Doing so will help get us the malaria medicine we need. But he doesn't even introduce himself until you talk to him the second time, giving you more details about his role, his backstory, and his character motivations. This added detail isn't necessarily pertinent to our mission, but it does help frame the world and set up some expectations of conflict ahead. So am I still on this? Let's just make sure. Great. So the detail in this exchange with Ruben helps us set the stage for later plot points. It establishes the NPC as a pivotal character and a trustworthy ally for gathering information and reporting on events around Port Saleo, one of the main locations of Far Cry 2. Though the interaction doesn't have specific choice branches like modern games, and some of which we'll look at, returning to him in the sequence is a choice in and of itself. This is the heart of the layer cake technique. First encounter is the most basic information, but each additional encounter provides an added layer of detail. So stories of all kinds, have all kinds of details, whether it be dense prose, nuanced inflections, or one-line descriptions, excuse me. I love this, by the way. However, not all readers want details. The balance between information and details is a tightrope walk that I struggle with constantly in my own writing. So Wedding and O'Connor and the narrative team understood that story needed to be organically integrated into gameplay, and that if it was forced, particularly upon players that are not used to narrative-driven content in first-person shooter games, then the underlying message they wanted to convey might actually deter players from engaging. So the layer cake technique not only provides gung-ho players an opportunity to get the immediate information they need to advance, plot progression, but rewards interested players with additional details that enrich gameplay. In a subtle design maneuver, the Far Cry 2 narrative design team shows the player that an engaging story, as we all know, actually makes the game better. When you offer details, you offer more opportunities for deeper connections to the experience. Like what's happening here. Now, there's been a lot of advances in this technique over the years. In this first iteration, like we saw, there's a notable lack of player input. There are no branches, there are no routes. There are not any opportunities for the player to shape the story and to actively dive deeper into the layer cake through direct dialogue options. Many studios have built incredible systems for making dynamic and engaging and agency-rich stories. And very widely speaking, general audience gamers have become much more literate. Folks, broadly speaking, are more willing to entertain dense story within AAA titles, so much so that it has become almost a default point of critical reception. But I want to celebrate the layer cake method because it offers a creative opportunity for designers and writers to think about how to parse their stories. Like My Darling Child, not all readers are looking for detail. Sometimes they just want to try to sleepwalk through the story. So how then does one go about designing stories that can simultaneously satiate sleepy children and erudite adults? So you first start with the most pertinent information. Give the player an immediate hook that requires a decision and/or activates a gameplay mechanic. You start a quest, you add an NPC to your journal, you unlock a map marker. Then use what Emily Short would describe as a waypoint narrative technique. Players can choose topics, but specific triggers but with specific triggers in those choices, they can either unlock another layer of the gameplay mechanic, an optional side quest, journal details, a fast travel option, or move the narrative toward a specific outcome or conflict. Each additional layer after this is kind of pure story. In the deeper layers is where the flavor of your cake is baked. So it's important to note that layer cake narratives can stack high, but they can't really stack wide. This is to say that this message usually requires building off recently obtained information. Rarely would you use this method to stretch across entire stories. You instead use it for a specific exchange. Layer caking a central protagonist's entire narrative arc is probably not optimal. But you could use it for a particular beat that reveals a secret or backstory or pivotal plot point. So like all good students of the craft, it might prove useful to read the masters And these examples are not exhaustive, and in some cases aren't even the best examples of games writing that I've experienced, but they utilize the layer cake method very well. And as a result, I found appreciation, and as a result, they've found appreciation and adulation from a range of audiences. It should be no surprise that some of the examples that I'll point to fall within the otherwise boring gun game genre. This is primarily because of, one, its origins, and two, its mechanical composition. Linear first-person games that employ checkpoints, missions, and quests benefit from this type of storytelling. Even without putting a gun in the player's hands, okay, cool. Story is cool. Okay, so let's look at it, an example. I'm actually not going to play the clip, but I'm going to instead just point to an example from the Outer Worlds. So early on in the game, you experience this kind of pivotal quest where you're making a very important decision that can shape the world. And what I want to highlight is how choices in the Outer Worlds steer the player towards understanding the circumstances of an NPC in order to complicate the gameplay choices. This type of complex storytelling where the choices of the player extend beyond branching dialogue and spill outward into the game world are an excellent example of using the layer cake method to make player agency not just affect NPC chatter, but fundamentally alter the story. Not only is the layer cake method used to advance a quest, but it also provides the player with some much needed context for a larger plot. Spacer's choice becomes then a focal point of investigation, so the smallness of this singular quest or dispute is layered within the details of a much larger interplanetary struggle. I'm going to skip over this part to look at another example, which is funny because Matt was just talking about Norco. It's really hard to see this. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to skip over the second half of this as a way of just to move on. So the dialogue snippet with Million, your cyborg nanny best friend, points players to the next immediate need, right? A fuse. But by also hinting at the missing phone call, the player is able to choose an emotional response to the brother's absence, which Million then goes on to defend. And this is actually quintessential layer caking. Give the player the most essential information first, find the fuse, add some intriguing details, the missed phone call, and then leave open the opportunity for the player to explore the story more, discuss your family. Norco uses this technique repeatedly by giving players immediate tasks, destinations, and story progression signposts peppered with optional dialogue that beautifully and playfully fills in the details of the game world. I had a whole bit about the mind map that I'm going to skip over just for sake of time. Also, Matt talked about it before. I can talk about why this is such a cool thing of extending layer caking, but I'm going to continue. So before wrapping up, I want to talk some more about my kids as it relates to the discussion. One thing I strategically overlooked to share from my initial observations was how the narrative design, or writing, as most people would call it, of the children's books I was reading with my kiddo were intended to be educational. Not that Pete the Cat is teaching my son continental philosophy, but instead was written using an early reader formula called I Can Read. Created by publisher HarperCollins, I Can Read books are intended to prepare youngsters for independent reading. If you visited a children's library or happened to browse a kids' corner in your local bookstore, you've inevitably seen these titles all over the place. This is in my local bookstore in Brooklyn. Though they're one step above board books, they're intended for early readers to participate sight words, phonics, sentence structure, and eventually understand complex plot at level 3. why this is relevant to our discussion, that these books are not just fanciful musings of creative authors, but are indeed designed objects intended to have specific, albeit educational, objectives. So my initial read of these titles being strategically akin to the narrative design techniques I learned while in the narrative department are actually not completely off base. I learned while, what Harper's Kids, the imprint of the I Can Read line of books intends is not to have the most engrossing story for advanced readers, but to create stories for a range of readers that can easily adapt to their specific preferences. And listen, I wouldn't directly advocate for formulaic storytelling, and I hope I don't come across as shilling for HarperCollins, but I do find it a bit uncanny that these stories, that these are designed story experiences are so closely related, if not by accident, to the job of a narrative designer. So a good story can certainly goes a long way, but an excellent design can elevate even the simplest narrative, like Pete the Cat. So what I've relearned from my impatient toddler is to package my prose in a layer cake so that I might better draw players into my stories. Thank you so much.
We have another question.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the Norco example in particular with layer caking. Because it seems like at the first layer, they actually don't give you the option to eject before you get to the second layer,
Yep.
whereas most games would if they were doing it the traditional layer cake way.
For sure. It's a great point. And I think that this speaks to, yes, thank you so much, B. The question was about how in kind of traditional layer cake design, there would be a route to kind of offshoot right away after getting the first kind of primary layer of information, right? And Norco kind of forces the player to dive a little bit deeper. I think this relates to players being just like a little bit more literate. Like I said, I think that players are, by and large, especially players that are going into the experience of Norco, are a little bit, they've been kind of primed the pump, right? They kind of know that they are going into a narrative experience. So I think that there's an expectation that there won't be just an immediate offshoot. I will say, though, there are a lot of options in Norco where you can decide to disengage right away. In fact, a scene following just that one where you go to the gas station, you can choose whether or not to engage with an antagonist in that moment, almost like right away, right? Instead of like choosing to fight them or whatever. And that has like kind of some structural differences and changes within the narrative. But I think that just kind of speaks to some of the expectations of a player base that game is kind of catering to. Other questions?
Yeah. Your point that you made about the I Can Read book being kind of strategically designed to engage kids' attention and interest and how they build across, a scale of difficulty.
Yeah.
Do you think that the growing complexity of game stories may have also had the same effect on players? Like that's why it's so popular, there's a scaling interest as they learn to play games with more story.
So I am officially announcing now I'm starting an I Can Read studio. I love that idea though. I'm sure there are like syllabi and curricula out there that are like, here's how to onboard yourself into narrative heavy games. Like I know that those exist. I wonder how you could do that within a game itself. I think that that's a kind of more, maybe that was your central question, is like, how do you get players that are expecting one type of experience to then end in a different type of experience? I think a very recent and somewhat topical game like Clair Obscur is like a good example of that, where folks are going and being like, like JRPG, let's do this. I'm going to parry the hell out of this, and then they like get into the story and they start crying. And like, that's, just like good design of like showcasing what maybe the core mechanic is going to be, and then sneaking in, or not sneaking in, but then pairing that with really compelling narrative. That's just like a game that comes off the top of my head. But I think like the question is really interesting. Like, how do you do this? I think that that's what's really great about layer caking, is that like you could do what Norco does, where you could start with just one layer, right? But by the end of the game, maybe you're presenting much more complex layers, right? So that by the time that the the player has kind of inculcated themselves to the experience in the game world, then they are more ready for a much more denser experience. The example that I had, actually, the kind of flippant example that I had earlier of Undertale, I think actually does that pretty well too. There's like flippancy and jokiness and like off the cuff comments and meta textual commentary about gameplay, right? But as you go further into the experience, you're kind of like more ready for the game to talk to you in very meaningful ways. So thinking about how you can kind of staircase that over an entire experience is, I think, an interesting design challenge for sure. And I tend to think too, a really good way of doing that is just being like kind of silly to get started, like making the stakes very low initially, that then when there are more impactful stakes later on in the story, they like really land in those moments. Yeah.
I'm curious if you, both with reading to your kids with these children's books, but also with games, see a linguistic or poetic difference between what gets naturally skipped by your kids or between these upper layers.
Yeah.
Like is there an element, I mean, I don't mean to like throw a javelin here, but is there an element where like the more detailed layers aren't written as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Thanks. That's the question was about, is there a linguistic pattern of skipping over details, and a question of whether those details are sometimes not as written as compellingly. It was a question that, or like a conversation that I was having with some folks earlier about ethereal voice, right? And I tend to think that games that don't employ this type of technique, or even are giving some cadence to this type of technique, are very heavily ethereally delivered, right? That's like not a good phrase, but they're very prosy, right? And they really lean on the prose as being the central conceit of the experience, right? A beautiful line of articulation is the core game mechanic, right? So I don't know if there's necessarily a pattern, but I think that there is maybe poor delivery tactics, right? So I think that when things get skipped over, it's because the stage hasn't been set very well to expect that you want the player to like receive the content very well. So I don't know, because I think like, I also think that when you're writing in this method and you're delivering information, it's very hard to make delivery of information, that top layer, written poorly, because if it doesn't work, it just doesn't work, right? Whereas if you're going into that world building and that kind of more prosy element of pure story layer, you can miss the mark, right? Where somebody's like, I don't care about this 10,000 year war, like skip, like, whatever it might be. So I think that I think it can be a combination of delivery and like, yeah, like, brevity of the content itself. That being said, I like saying that, like, it's depending about the context and the situation. I submitted my game to a narrative-based festival many years ago, and the first thing that somebody did when they sat down and played my experience in the arcade is that they went like this. And then they got to a choice and they were like, and they gave it up and And so my design response to that was to make a patience meter, so that while the person was going through, this patience meter would clock down, and that if they became too impatient, the game would end. And so that was my way of giving a little bit of a middle finger to the impatient player, but it also structurally made sense within the dynamic of the experience, I hope. Thank you, everyone.